you, Karen. First of all, welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar tonight, and thank you to Karen for extending the opportunity for Deanna and I to speak. My name is Adam Gregg. I am a 1993 initiate of the Beta Chi chapter at Drake University. My current role, as it's pertinent to what we're going to talk about today, I am the PGY1 Pharmacy Residency Program Director at Gunderson Lutheran Medical Center, Gunderson Health System, which is in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I have been Residency Program Director since 2007. Before that, a little bit of my background. My residency training was through the University of Oklahoma. So whoop whoop for any Gamma Omicrons that are out there listening. In a world pre-PGY1, PGY2, I actually completed my specialty residency in primary care, which actually isn't even a thing right now per ASHP, down at OU, and then came to Gunderson afterwards. So I've been here 16 years now, involved with the training program this whole time. In addition to being residency program director, I am the student coordinator for the experiential training here at Gunderson, and have worked with multiple students over the years. So I've seen the residency process from all ends. In addition, I work with our department management and leadership with position recruitment. So I'm going to be tapping into that experience and conveying some of that for your benefit with what follows. Deanna?
All right, thanks, Adam. And so I am Deanna McDaniel, and I am a 1996 initiate of the Delta Zeta chapter, which is the University of Iowa. And then I actually, as well, did a pre-ASHP nomenclature of primary care residency program. And that was in 2001, and that actually was at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics, where I currently am a practice specialist in ambulatory care. And so I got hired on right out of the gate of my residency into a joint funded faculty position with the College of Pharmacy and the University of Iowa Hospitals. And I also took over as program director of our program, which is a unique program in that it is a PGY, I'm the director of the PGY2 ambulatory care program, but we also have a PGY1 tract that has an ambulatory focus, and I'm the coordinator of that program. So we early commit all of our residents into the PGY2 currently, and I've been doing that since 2007. So Adam and I started as our residency directors around the same time. And I've been with the university for over that whole time, so for 15 years. And then also, too, I do have, since I'm an associate professor, we obviously have a lot of opportunities to work with students and give talks on the same topic at the college level. And so, again, I can speak from experience from numbers of years and many students that have come through my doors asking some of these same questions that you will inevitably have tonight. So without further ado, I guess, Adam, do you want to get started in the first?
Yeah. So now that you know a little more about Deanna and my background, to help us get a sense of who's in the audience, we'd like to run through 3 quick questions for you. So the first is to get a sense of what age of student it is that we're talking to. So I've opened the poll. Hopefully you all can see that in the right-hand dashboard for each of you. So if you can let us know how many years of education do you have remaining in pharmacy school before graduation?
It's looking like a lot of last year professional students.
But, you know, still about 40% of you are still have some time, and that's great because we're actually, some of the material that we're going to talk about is, you know, pertinent certainly to everyone as you look ahead to the next step in your career. But it's helpful to know, and actually very heartening to know that a lot of you are looking ahead. So that's great.
That's awesome. Good.
All right. I'm going to close that poll and then move on to polling question number 2. In terms of right now, after graduation, what do you anticipate that your career trajectory will be? Whether that's immediately into practice, seeking further training through residency or fellowship, further education in some type of master's or doctorate program, or you're still taking it all in and thinking about your options, which is a very valid response. All right, so it looks like a fair number of you are looking at postgraduate training, residency or fellowship, and certainly a lot of what we'll be talking about relates to that process. But I do want to emphasize, even though we may be, Deanna and I may be talking about things as it relates to residency, a lot of this is very directly translatable into looking at positions, evaluating options, and certainly as it relates to applying and interviewing for positions as well.
Absolutely.
All right. And then our last question here is, in general, what do you hope to get out of this webinar? Is it just somewhat advice, how to build a portfolio of experience that will help you be competitive as you look for positions in the future? Is it actually navigating the process, whether that's finding a position, the wonders of the showcase and the match? Is it looking at strategies for successful interviewing, or perhaps is it all of the above?
Good. Looks like a lot of all the above.
Okay. Not surprisingly, and luckily, we're going to incorporate all of that into our material. Perfect. All right. So with that,
so I'm going to go over just what the learning objectives are, just to orient you to how this presentation is going to happen. Is we're going to pretty much alternate slide to slide. However, I'm sure there'll be slides where I'm taking the lead, but Adam will have things that he would like to add, just and vice versa. So bear with us here. We will probably be looking to see if questions are coming in. So if you have questions as we're going through, please feel free to type those out. Karen is also in the background helping us to make sure we're keeping mindful of that. And then depending on how many questions we come through, we'll try to maybe even take a break midway and answer some of those. But so for the objectives of tonight's webinar, we hope to just identify some of those common pitfalls or maybe mistakes that residency applicants frequently make when you're doing the application and or the interview process. And then the second would be just to describe any sort of strategies that a candidate can use to help maximize a positive impact during the interview process, because that's obviously can be the make or break in the interview process. And then formulate just substantive responses to interview questions, since I know that becomes very daunting sometimes, is what will I be asked during the interview.
And in interest, some of you who may have been at GCC last year, this presentation mirrors what Deanna and I presented there. And at that time, Grand Regent Latha, who was planning GCC, asked Deanna and I to present something that was going to be brutally honest. So I think the verbatim quote was she wanted us to show everyone some tough love. So that's what we're going to do. And what we're talking about isn't necessarily certainly to scare anyone or make them feel cynical or certainly not hopeless, but the process is competitive, and certainly you don't need Deanna and I to tell you about that. But there's some things with a little bit of planning and a fair amount of thoughtfulness. There's some common pitfalls and I guess traps that you can avoid fairly easily, in large part through awareness and making this a concerted effort or journey through the process as opposed to sort of a haphazard one. So that's what we're going to try to help you accomplish today by identifying some of those traps or areas that some of your peers may get caught in. So before we jump into thinking about that immediate run-up to finding a position, for those of you who have a year or more of schooling left before you start that journey to look towards a position, certainly there's some things that you can do to start preparing and differentiating yourself. And we kind of call that being a resident in student's clothes. Really sort of trying on that role to a great degree in terms of what you can while you're still in that didactic period. So some things that we want you to think about is, really being conscious and cultivating your experience, both academically to some degree, although, we know that most schools of pharmacy have a pretty mapped out curriculum. But if you have some opportunity for taking different elective experiences, being conscientious about that. But perhaps more for, being selective and cultivating your non-curricular experience. So all of the activities, the work and internships that you do. And something that's very important is really thinking about focusing on depth of experience and not necessarily breadth. While certainly programs and positions want you to be well-rounded, what we also really like to see is engagement and involvement. And so rather than doing, being involved in 10 different things but to a very surface degree, picking maybe 3 or 4 things and really finding a role and gaining responsibilities. And remembering that that doesn't always mean that you need to be in a named position, but finding a way to show commitment and engagement, and also getting something where you can learn something out of that experience. All of that is really going to position and situate you well for that final year, not just in terms of building your CV, but giving you some of that experience that then you can talk to in interviews and actually help shape who you are as a practitioner. When it comes to selecting both IPPE and APPE, really seeking out a rigorous slate of experiences, challenging yourself, selecting, within the parameters that your school allows you to, experiences that are going to maybe push you out of your comfort zone. If you've had an intern or work position in something for several years, find something that's different from that. Maybe things that you wouldn't normally pick or do. Even if there's something that you don't necessarily gravitate towards or enjoy, you always still learn something from that. So, being conscientious about selecting some of that. Another thing to think about is, as a student, finding different projects that are going to be maybe similarly substantive or in focus as what a resident may complete. Is there a faculty person or someone at your workplace that's working on some type of analysis project? Are they doing some clinical research? Even taking a part of that, whether that's helping with data collection or analysis, organizing, all of that's valuable experience, and it shows that you can take the next step and go above and beyond and really gain something of that's going to help you. So again, as an underclassman, there's definitely things that you can think about and do that will position you very well moving into that 4th year.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the dreaded curriculum vitae. This is something that I'm sure all of you and majority of the students were in there at least have 1 or 2 years left of school. And if you haven't, if you were in that group, small group of you that are maybe even yet just like a P1 or P2, this is a great time to get started on your CV and or if you are in the older groups getting ready to graduate here in the next few months, I'm sure you have a CV already prepped and ready. This is one of those things that's going to sell you. So it is time. We try to have a kitschy statement on each slide here, but it is time. The CV is a time for you to brag about yourself, obviously, but being humble as well, so you're not completely over bragging. But the biggest thing about the CV, I would say, is honestly, people ask me the question all the time, and I'm sure the same comes to Adam: is what stands out on a CV? And it's really hard when, as a residency director looking at, gosh, we probably look at over 100 CVs a year with all the applicants for the various programs at the U for me, and I'm sure Adam has a similar number that you look at. And the ones that stand out are really those ones that are kind of clean, crisp, clear, and concise, I would definitely say. So you can tell that it has a level of detail that's needed to try to explain what's going on and tell about you, I guess, over the course of your career as a student. Um, Also, we want to make sure there's not any obvious glaring errors, so formatting or, of course, grammar or spelling. That is something that I have a very evil eye for. So it's very important that you also, to look at the content, is that you just include things with a real critical eye. So give it the time test. So this is a question I also get a lot: is how often or how far back should I go? And I think it's tricky. So if you're probably like what we consider the traditional pharmacy student who maybe has, 1 or 2 year undergrad prior to pharmacy school, or now even maybe a 4 year degree, I think going back probably for your entirety of pharmacy school is reasonable, but what did you do during undergrad? Maybe there was something that was really important to you, or makes you a kind of highlights something maybe very unique to you as well. I think that's totally warranted to be on there. As a P1 or P2, going back definitely into undergrad is absolutely reasonable. I think as you get into your 4th year, you don't necessarily have to go back too far before pharmacy school, but it kind of depends on what your career path has been. I think ultimately, definitely I wouldn't include a whole lot from high school. However, I would say that and Adam, you may have a different feeling on this, but if there's something that you achieved um, very, very important to you in high school. Maybe you were, I don't even know what they call them in like Eagle Scouts or something like that, or you did a lot of, I guess, activities in the community. Those would be things that maybe to highlight. But we all know that pharmacy students are probably all very smart and graduated probably close to the top of their class or whatnot. So I don't think that's necessary. But on the other thing I wanted to say is if you're a non-traditional student and you've been out in practice and maybe you're coming back after maybe being in practice 15 years or something, I don't know if that really resonates with any of you out there today, but there is that something got you to where you are today, and I don't think losing that is necessarily a bad, or having that on your CV is not necessarily a bad thing. So explaining kind of what your career path has been, I think, is a good thing. So the rigor test is just to reflect kind of the depth of involvement. So just as Adam was talking about in the last slide about when you're engaged in an organization, for example, is what was your involvement? What did you do? Having a few bullets is always appropriate, especially if you were, in a leadership position, to explain what your role was, or if you were in a committee and kind of what your work is. But be mindful of the reader too. So don't include paragraphs and paragraphs. I would say no more than 1 or 2, maybe 3 max of bullets per, experience that you're trying to highlight. And so that's the avoiding the padding. So I think we generally, residency directors and people that look at CVs a lot, kind of get an idea of someone that's trying to sell themselves, but they also can get us a tell on students that are trying to pad or kind of inflate something. This isn't here, but the other thing I'm going to tell you is pharmacy is a small world. So make sure that you don't put things on there that you didn't do. Inevitably, that'll come back to bite you. But also make sure you're putting things on there that you do. And I think that's why it's important that you start early. You start, I update my CV on, frankly, every month if I can get to it. Sometimes it goes a couple months, but it's so important because you lose sight of some of the things that you've done in your career. And so I think it's important to, and also too, if you're trying to write about maybe a leadership position you had 2 years ago because you forgot to put it on your CV, you're going to forget some of the things that you did at that time. So it's important that you update it. And probably for students, I would say maybe every semester would be a more reasonable time frame on that. And then that just goes into highlighting what's unique to you. So every, if it's scholarship or if it's teaching or research or maybe leadership, those are some things you want to highlight. Make sure you don't leave any of that out too. And then lastly, I cannot say this enough, but review, review, review. I mean, don't hesitate to ask your mom or your dad or your brother or sister, colleague or roommate or whatever to review your CV. In fact, I had a student recently ask me to review his, and sure enough, found 2 spelling errors, which I'm sure he's had multiple people review and just totally got missed. And so I think just having people review it is always a good thing. So, Adam, did you have anything more to add on that?
No, I agree, and having absolutely multiple people take eyes at your CV at multiple points. When you work on a document so long, you see what you want to see, and it makes sense to you. So, one thing to think about, not only have, mentors or preceptors or other people that you've worked with from the pharmacy world take a look, but I do think it's valuable to have maybe some untrained eyes look at it as well, whether that's parents or maybe non-pharmacy friends. One of the reasons I think that's valuable is because that helps sort of delinguize to some degree, especially different things that are maybe very obvious to you in your circle from the School of Pharmacy, but if you're applying outside that circle, they may not know what that means. And sometimes that's helpful to point that out. And absolutely, I mean, typos happen to everyone, but at the same time, do you want your first impression of somebody makes of you to be that you misspelled something silly? I mean, and again, not that this justifies it, but there are individuals out there that will make snap judgments about you based on that. So those are simple, easy steps to take to minimize the likelihood of that happening.
And Adam, before we move on, there was a question about this slide, and I was reading. So if you're a non-traditional, the question was, and you did something work related that was not pharmacy, should you include it? And I would say absolutely yes. For example, I had a question of a student many years ago who had worked at Victoria's Secret, and she was nervous about putting that on her CV because that's what she did in undergrad, and thought maybe that would have a bad connotation. And I said, you know what, being a teller or a customer service representative for regardless of the business shows that you have customer service abilities, and in pharmacy, frankly, we're all in customer service as a business, so I think that's absolutely something you should highlight. But no, definitely, and if you don't have it on there, guaranteed you're going to get asked, so what happened to you for 10 years? What did you do in your non-traditional life? And truly, for non-traditional students, some of that experience you have is what really sells you apart from some other students. So yes, I would include that personally.
And I agree. And again, especially if it helps illustrate some characteristics of you that are going to be valuable or an asset in the position that you're looking for. Kind of along that same lines, I remember a student that I had several years ago that had worked basically for the bulk of her undergrad as a certified nursing assistant. And she didn't put that on her CV. And I really had to encourage her to do that, because even though it wasn't pharmacy, absolutely, there was so much she gained knowledge about healthcare that out of that experience. So, when you think about professional experience, I mean, you have some liberty to think a little outside the box. All right. So you've got your CV polished. Now you are moving on to make some initial contact with the programs or potential employers that you are interested in. And many of you maybe already have had opportunities to do this at College of Pharmacy sponsored fairs. Several different state organizations have meetings where there are different showcases at. Certainly the largest from a residency program standpoint is coming up here in early December, and that's the ASHP mid-year clinical meeting, where the majority of ASHP accredited residencies have showcases. For those of you that have been to the ASHP mid-year and specifically to the showcase, you will corroborate my saying that as a student, it can be very overwhelming. I kid you not when I say that it's like a stampede of bulls, especially that first showcase when they open the doors. I've seen pushing and shoving. So my first advice to everyone at ASHP is take a deep breath and don't let everyone else's craziness influence you. You know, each of the showcases at ASHP is 3 hours. You are not going to miss much if you kind of let the wild and crazies go in for those first 10 minutes and then sort of calmly walk in and after you've gathered your thoughts and your composure and move in. But nevertheless, I mean, certainly showcases do have time limits, and especially very large ones. You do need to go in with a plan in terms of which programs you want to talk to. You know, the nice thing about ASHP is that you have the timetable as well as a floor map of the exhibit hall ahead of time. So I would actually recommend mapping it out in some type of logical sequence. And you know, the question, how many programs can I talk to in a showcase? I mean, you do need to be realistic. I think in terms of how long you budget your time for an interaction at each program, I guess to somewhat depends on how many different individuals you anticipate interacting with there. For most programs, you can expect that all of the current residents, inclusive of both the PGY1 and PGY2 programs, will be there. Most programs have several of the faculty that are involved with each of those training programs, and most programs will have the director as well. So I guess, you know, in thinking about how much time you spend, think about who do I want to interact with and talk to at that program. Right from the get-go, recognize you won't get a chance to talk to every individual, nor should you. You know, probably in my mind, the biggest bang for the buck is talking to the current residents, because to a large degree, I mean, they were in your shoes 12 months previous. You know, they are going to be very aware of what your concerns, apprehensions, questions are, and be able to speak to that. Also, I mean, I tell my residents, you know, December, you know, there's a lot, you know, there's some not so good things about always having ASHP in December, since that's such a busy month, you know, just in terms of all the other holiday and other things going on. But in terms of the residency year, that's actually a really good time to have it, because residents are going to be brutally honest. They're kind of, maybe not at a rock bottom moment, but, you know, they're realizing, oh no, I still have more than half of my year to go. I'm behind on 4 deadlines. I'm, you know, not as far ahead on my project. I mean, they're going to tell you like it is. And a good program should be honest with you and recognize that every program has its merits, its strengths. Every program has its liabilities and weaknesses as well. So, you know, the residents are really going to be well equipped to speak to that. You know, do you need to speak to the director at every program? You know, I think that's up to you and the feeling that you get from that interaction with the resident, and perhaps to what degree, based on what you know and what that interaction has been, Is this something that you really feel positive about and anticipate that you might apply towards? But again, recognize you just from a timing standpoint, you won't have the luxury of having a 30-minute conversation with everyone. You need to read the environment, and that includes being cognizant of what other traffic they have. If you're talking with someone at the showcase and you recognize that there's sort of a crowd of several individuals behind you, and you just keep monopolizing that individual's time, that likely will not be received well. So you need to get some practice in reading what's going on around you. We also have on the slide to avoid lurking. And I guess what I mean by that is, if you are going to go to a showcase and talk to a program, you need to actually talk to them. If you just kind of hover in the background and not actually reach out and make contact or make really any impression with anyone, the impression that you give is that at best you are so painfully shy that you have a hard time interacting, which, as a pharmacist, we all need to interact with other individuals, and no matter what our position is, so that's not necessarily a positive, or that, really you're not that interested. So, if you get to a program, you do want to make a point to at least reach out and talk to one individual there. Another thing to think about with that, especially if you are, it is a program that has a lot of traffic, is, find opportunities to transition in. You don't want to barge in and insert yourself in the middle of a conversation that maybe someone from that program and another potential applicant are. But as maybe one person ends their question or thought, kind of approach and listen, and if read the body language, if they kind of open themselves to you and feel kind of invite you in, I think that's a reasonable thing to kind of jump in then and be part of that. Another really key thing, and I'm going to ask or indirectly answer one of the questions here from Diana. What are some good questions to ask residents? And I'll take this a step back. You want to ask educated questions that show that you've already done, to some degree, some homework about the program. As a program director, one of the questions I dread the most is, so tell me something about the program.
Oh gosh, yes.
Because number one, that's so broad. I mean, where do you even start? Number two, what that says to me is, gosh, you really did not look at any of the materials, either through the ASHP directory, through our program website, through reaching out and talking to anybody. That really doesn't show much initiative. And so, I'll be very honest, usually when that question gets asked to me, I kind of go into robot mode and launch into my little canned spiel. And not that that's a bad thing, but, ultimately that, probably, I don't want to say it's not fair, but, that results in not having as individual and probably as meaningful of an interaction with that individual as perhaps it could have otherwise done had they asked me something maybe a little more specific or substantive. So I would say look at the directory, look at the materials that are out there. Good questions are asking for clarifications of some of that. If you can reference what you already know, for example, I see that your staffing requirement is every third weekend. Can you tell me what areas the residents staff in? That, again, asserts to whoever you're talking to, gosh, they do know a little something about this. They're familiar with the lingo. They really have thought about us and our program. Couple of things out there for those of you that are a bit more introverted or, maybe not as comfortable in that, mass showcase interaction. I know many individuals like to buddy up with another friend or friends and kind of go from showcase to showcase. On one hand, that's reasonable, but again, I go back to, if you choose to do that, make sure that you all are equally interacting. Oftentimes in a situation like that, there's a tendency for one or two individuals to kind of take the lead, and then you have sort of a pack of lurkers in the background. And again, that doesn't always necessarily make the most positive impression. Another tip and strategy, if you're struggling, when you are talking with someone, maybe it's someone that's on the faculty and you just really, you blank or don't know a question to ask, you can always ask them about themselves, and not make it painfully obvious that, you're buttering them up, by saying, oh, I really like the shoes that you're wearing, where did you get them? But, ask them about their journey. People like generally talking about themselves. How did they get into their current position? What training did they have? What's been helpful? Even if it's not specifically about the program, you can get a sense of them and what their personality is just from that interaction, because that says a lot about the program as well. And you get the bonus of them perceiving you as someone who's engaged and interested as well. Deanna, do you have some other thoughts about the showcase?
No, I think you said it correctly. I think the only other thing is, I think you're absolutely right. The bane of my existence when at the mid-year is when someone says, just tell me about your program. Honestly, we've got short period of time and you want to sell yourself, and if I need to spend 20 minutes telling you the ins and outs of the program, then ultimately that's going to maximize probably the amount of time that I'm going to have with just a single person versus, trying to get others involved. The other thing I would just say that one of the things I've identified is when you finally have gotten, if you're in a booth that's really busy and you've finally gotten the opportunity to talk to the person you've been seeking out, and you're in the middle of your spiel, if you notice there's like 5 or 6 other people kind of waiting behind you, one of the things I've been most impressed by is if candidates say, well, come on in, I'm just asking general questions, because ultimately they're probably going to have some of the same questions. And then that just shows that you as a candidate are open and willing to not just like steal that time. So, and that's tricky. So just kind of use common sense, use general politeness, and I think you'll be great. There's generally, for the most part, the mid-year showcase is just for us to get to know the programs and identify those ones maybe that you are definitely excited about, but also too the ones that now after just meeting them for like 10-15 minutes you're like, no way could I work there for a year. So that's truly a lot of what the showcase is. So, and if the residents do seem happy, genuinely happy, then that's probably a program that you should really look at. If they seem miserable, then maybe there's something there. That's a tell. So.
Right.
Yeah, that's all I had to say about that. All right. Well, guys, I think we're going to keep moving on because, Adam, it is 8:40. So
I know. And I knew we'd get to talking, so.
I know. So this slide is actually fairly brief. I think ultimately you are going to be asked, what do you want to do? Why do you want to do this? And so for my program, what is it about ambulatory care that you enjoy, or how did you get interested in this? So you're going to really need to articulate your goals, and so this would be something to definitely do some introspection, think about where is it that got you here today. Include both some of your goals that you have, obviously professionally. So what do you hope to do when you graduate from a residency program? Do you think you might do a PGY2? Is there a particular area you want to focus in? And then, but also personally, what do you want to work on? Inevitably, when you get a residency, you're going to sit down with your residency director and do a training plan. You're going to sit down and and we're going to ask you those hard questions. So what do you want to get out of this year? And we're going to customize the training plan for each resident. And the term here, the bullet about getting in the driver's seat, and I'm stealing this from Adam, but it's essentially, when you're driving somewhere, you have a destination that you need to get to, but you're not necessarily always looking on, each exit as you go along. But really in pharmacy, there's going to be an end all. So in 5 years, you want to be here, but there is going to be a lot of well, forks in the road that potentially could come along, different exits that you may take through the way, in various ways for you. So just be in the driver's seat as you're going forward in your career path, and think about those different areas of training and or I guess aspects of a residency program that will help really match what you want to get out of a program to really meet your personal and professional goals. Learning preferences, obviously everyone has their own preference for how they learn. One of the biggest thing there would be how autonomous, maybe as a resident, do you get opportunities to be autonomy, I'm sorry. And then just that would probably be something that's going to be asked of you. And then embrace your failures. This is a hard one, and I've had a lot of students where maybe they had a really bad semester, for example, and they just didn't do well, or their mom died in school and they just had a really rough course, or gosh, they had to repeat a class, something like that. So we all have failures, and the thing is, and I'm honest about, I almost quit pharmacy school many years ago when I was in pharmacy school because of a really bad semester I had, but I embraced that and I learned from it. So I think as long as you can learn from something that happened to you, and you can articulate how that really helped mold you to who you are today, I think that's totally appropriate to embrace and not just completely shy away from, but do it in a way that's artful too, so you're not just I guess totally selling all of your skeletons in your closet, I guess. And then the last thing is just your social media. I bring this up only because Facebook and now Snapchat and Instagram and all these other things that are out there, Twitter. We personally, as a program, I don't have time to go out and try to look at social media for each of the candidates that applies to the program. However, I know there are programs that do that, and residents sometimes do that as well. So make sure that your social media that's representing you is professional, especially in light of, recent politics and various other things. Just make sure that you have your news feed looks clean. If it's blocked down, if you want that, that your profile picture isn't something that you wouldn't want your mom to see, So those are going to be things that just make sure you're aligned with as you are applying for programs. And I think that's it on that slide, Adam.
All right. So references. And again, regardless of position, you are going to be asked for different individuals that can attest to and elaborate on your characteristics. And especially for residency applications, they will be actually authoring different attestations to that as well. In selecting references, I guess what we would urge you to do is put some thought into this and really think about who can speak to the qualities that I have that are going to, best predict success in that future position. Furthermore, who can speak to me in a personalized way about those qualities, and not so just in a positive, but really in a way that differentiates and individualizes me from the many others that are going to be seeking that position as well. I think a lot of times you hear what I call the 1-1-1 strategy. You pick one faculty member, you pick one preceptor, you pick one individual that you've worked with as an intern or in some other capacity. And certainly, many times that fits, right? Those are individuals that potentially speak to a lot of the different faces and roles that you've had throughout your pharmacy career. But I guess one thing I would say is don't limit yourself to thinking that's the only combination that you have. Maybe you've had some really valuable motivating preceptors that you've connected with on several of your rotations that you've learned a lot from and you've really connected with. There's nothing that says that you can't use several of those. Or maybe you've had, going back to what Deanna talked about before, maybe you had a position that wasn't specifically pharmacy, but really, it showed a lot of leadership or creativity or responsibility. Those are all potentially individuals. If you go back to thinking about what can they say about me that is really going to sell me, and make a case that I should be someone that you interview and take the next step. One thing to think about is that the most quote unquote popular or prestigious names, while they may be prestigious, aren't always the best choices, in the sense that if that individual has 25 applicants that have asked them to write recommendations for them, not saying that that individual won't do a very admirable or serviceable job, but just the law of odds, the likelihood that they're going to have the luxury of time to individualize that to a great degree is probably going to be less. Similarly, and I will tell you, as someone who's seen recommendations over the years from some individuals who frequently have students ask them to write recommendations, if they use generally the same format for each of those letters, there's little words and phrases in there that really are the only different from reference to reference to reference. That's a big tell to me as a program director when I see that. If it's it's a pleasure to do this versus it's with great enthusiasm. I mean, those are, it seems silly, but those are little things that people that read applicants can pick up from. So maybe choosing someone that not as many of your peers asks to write may be to your advantage. And certainly the last point, generally we would hope this goes without saying, but please extend the courtesy to those individuals and ask them before you list them. If for no other reason, number one, to ascertain that they are willing to author something that's positive for you. Don't always assume that that's the case. But certainly just as a courtesy to them in respect for their time. Generally for residencies, a lot of these reference requests come between middle of December to whenever that program deadline is, which can be as early as December 31st, which isn't a lot of time, and it's often during finals. It's often during holiday and semester break when there are a lot of other activities going on. So reference writers need to budget their time to do this as well. So the more notice and the more courtesy that you can give them, I think the better situated you will be.
Adam, there are two questions that came in, and I think, I can answer one of, at least one of them. But sure. One of the questions was, would it be appropriate to select 3 different APPE preceptors, or max of 2? And I think ultimately the biggest thing there is as the forecast allows, the forecast system, which most programs go through, there are specific questions they're going to ask the referencer to write about or speak about. Occasionally people will still upload a letter as well. But I will tell you, a lot of the things they ask references are to really rank them in regards to their clinical skills and skill set, communication, etc. And so yes, other non-preceptors can write about those. But I would say having 2 preceptors, if you think they were really solid preceptors and and can really speak highly of you and you did really well in the rotation, I don't think is a bad thing. To have all 3, I definitely have seen that, and I don't know that's necessarily a bad thing, but again, it just kind of goes back to who's going to be the best reference for you and for that program.
And again, I guess to that, Deanna, I would add, certainly some of that depends on your own experience. And if through your APPEs, that's the bulk of where a lot of your professional experience lies, maybe that is appropriate. But one thing I would suggest is just like you want to be well balanced, you want to pick a slate of reference writers that's going to show some balance as well. So being cognizant of that. Another question that was asked is, should you ask the same reference to write different letters of recommendations based on the program you are applying to, or just one general reference? And again, for those programs that utilize forecasts, which now is the majority of ASHP accredited programs, it will generally populate the same questions and fields for every program. So when that reference completes it for one, it will automatically go ahead and populate it for the other programs in forecast. And there is one section for each that allows that program to individualize or ask separate questions. So I guess in a way it happens regardless, but certainly I guess if there's something specific that you would like that reference to speak to or address as it relates to an individual program, for example, if a program has a large rural health component, and that's something that's really a passion or interest of yours, letting that person know, hey, could you speak to this maybe in the program specific comment or something like that? I think that's absolutely reasonable.
I agree, 100%. Yep. One thing though, forecast does allow you to do as a student is select your reference to be just write one generic, and it will go to all the programs. I've had that happen a couple times. I would say that's probably, I would not as preferable on the reference side. You could ask your reference, but like Adam said, it auto-populates everything, and so if you want the reference to be able to customize it, you have to mark it as individual references or evaluations. If you do the one generic, there's no way to really customize it. So as a reference writer, I think it's important to have that ability to customize it if I want, which I tried to do. So, all right.
Agreed.
How would be, and then the next question is, professionally speaking, what would be a good way to ask a reference, of how they could be a good reference? And so honestly, I think there is truly just sitting down with them, calling them up on the phone. You could, of course, send them an email if you're far removed from the person, but I think the biggest thing is make sure they're going to be a positive reference writer. And that's going to be hard, but most reference writers, if they don't really think that they're going to say it, they might turn you down. They might skirt out of it and say, oh, I just don't have the time, or I'm going to be on vacation that time. But if you kind of get any sort of tells from the reference writer they're not going to really be a positive reference writer, you probably shouldn't ask them. And maybe even have a pinch hitter in the background that you might have said, I'm going to ask these other people, but really ultimately use the 3 solid ones. And also if a program asks you to have 3, don't reach out and get 6. I'm going to tell you that right now. That's one thing as a program I don't like getting 5 or 6 references when I've only asked for 3. Just because I just kind of wonder, did you not read the rules, or was there miscommunication or whatever? So I just don't think that's necessary personally.
It comes off as being either boastful or kind of a show-off. So It's generally accomplishes not what you're probably hoping to accomplish by having multiple references.
Yeah. Okay, so to be mindful of the time, gosh, we are like really low on time, and I know I can go over 9 o'clock. I don't know how this webinar works, and if it just cuts us right off at 9, but 9 o'clock I should say Central Time, but. So casting or not, I think the biggest thing here, and we all frankly know that, it's hard, and there is a lot of programs out there, and we also know that, frankly, there's not enough programs out there for the candidates that want a program. So you do need to be realistic in how many you can actually interview for, but it's really important to cast your net wide. Don't just apply or think about one program, because likely that's not going to be then the one that you get. So you just need to make sure you're applying for a realistic number. I don't really know what that is anymore, and it kind of depends on your financial means, abilities to travel, and rotation schedule that you're on at that time, and your preceptor, if they're willing to let you go or not. I know Iowa, at least we give our students 3 weeks off to kind of during that time, but not all schools do that. And so I think you have to be realistic about that. And forecast is frankly not cheap either. So the more programs you apply for, the more you have to pay. I would say just go back to what your goals are, and what you want, and do a pro and cons assessment. I mean, get a piece of scratch paper, do your positives and negatives, and write out those things that are positives about programs or negatives. And there might be some must-haves, and there might be some breakers for you too. And everyone's going to have different must-haves, and of course things that are going to be a deal breaker for them. So. And then letter of intent, I feel like by now you probably have heard this spiel about what you need to write in your letter of intent. There's generally a 3 to 4 maybe solid paragraphs. The first one is obviously explaining who you are and why you're a good match for the program or why you're interested in the program. It is very important to personalize it to the program. I will tell you, you can kind of read and tell if a letter is just a generic letter that they just slapped a new name on the top. And frankly, this is the hard one, but it is important to kind of personalize, write your letters kind of individual of themselves, and I mean, obviously certain things can be carried over from one to the other, but it's very important to sell why that program you think you're a good match for, and or it's a good match for what your goals are. Obviously, don't be modest. No life story, though, you guys. We don't want anything more than really a solid page, maybe a page and a smidge. But anything more than that, be mindful of your reader. We are reading a ton of letters of intent, and the longer they are, probably the easier it's going to be to just be forgotten. Also, make sure your grammar is good, your punctuation, grammar, spelling, all of that. Again, fair game. If that's your first thing you show up and have a bad letter of intent because there's some grammar issues in it, then that's going to be another tell. So those are kind of my big things there on that one.
All right. Preparing for the interview, and obviously, as Deanna referenced earlier, I mean, this is really the make or break moment, right? Where you've crafted your CV, you've polished your letter, and now this is really your best chance to make the biggest and broadest impression. And ultimately, preparation equals success, and that starts before the interview happens. So go back to the drawing board, do your homework again, make sure that you know the aspects of the program, the details about the structure that you can gain from the materials, so that you are well equipped to ask informed questions and receive the information in an educated way when you get to the interview day, that you don't have to waste time on some of the basics. It's so important to recognize what is expected of you and following directions. I think Deanna and I, if we haven't experienced it outright, I mean, certainly we've had colleagues that have had horror stories of interviewees that show up and didn't realize, oh, you expected me to give a case or something like that. Excuse me. Just about every program, I would imagine, is going to send you as an interviewee an itinerary ahead of time. Read through it, be familiar with it, know what each component entails, and what, if any, preparation you need to do to be ready for that. Another thing, don't bring people along that the program doesn't expect. And I can tell you this out of personal experience. I mean, certainly we recognize that as an applicant, I mean, you are more than just a potential resident. You may be a spouse, you may be a parent, certainly you have a family, and this is a big life decision, and yes, they're involved with that. But, having a significant other show up at dinner with us not knowing about it, or someone else showing up during the day, at best, it's awkward. And at worst, it sort of puts the program in a tough spot because, that's things that we weren't expecting. If someone brings a parent, well, why is that? Is it because they're so timid that they can't handle this alone, or what's going on? So if you, for whatever reason, have a need to do that, communicate ahead of time and ask permission for that. Again, just logistics of the day. Know where to go. and map it out ahead of time. You know, if you're staying in a hotel, how do I get from the hotel to the interview site? Don't rely necessarily just on GPS the morning of that, you know, hey, it's going to get me in the right spot. Figure it out ahead of time. Have the contact information ready in case there are unforeseen things that happen. A train stopped me, or there's an accident, or there's really bad traffic. You know, yes, unforeseen things happen, but it's going to be a much viewed more favorably if you can proactively communicate some of those unforeseen things ahead of time rather than showing up 10, 15, 20 minutes late to your interview. If you're flying somewhere, luggage gets lost. Make sure that you have essential things in your carry-on, whether that's components needed for the interview or a fresh pair of underwear and deodorant or things that you're going to need to be at your best that day. Another thing to think about is preparing a portfolio. And I guess what I mean by that is either something that physically exists or virtually, maybe on a cloud drive or something. Examples of work that you've done as a student that maybe you can utilize or reference during the interview day. And maybe they will ask you to do this or maybe not. But, you know, I think oftentimes that is a helpful thing that potentially to have access to if you're asked, you know, hey, on your CV, I see that you were involved with this medication use evaluation. And then if you, in the right forum, you can say, hey, I'll pull up my summary document and kind of talk you through, or here are the slides of this presentation. Again, maybe there's a low chance that that will come in handy, but I think it's a nice backup thing to have available if the opportunity presents yourself. And again, going into that interview, you know the majority of the questions are going to be based on that CV. You need to know it inside and out. If it's listed on that CV, you need to be able to speak to it in a substantive and informed way. So look at that again. There's a question, what should you include in a potential portfolio? You know, again, I think potentially examples of different projects you've worked on for an APPE rotation, perhaps for a job or as part of your curriculum. Again, thinking especially about some of those skills or characteristics that it might not necessarily be easy to talk to. I think those are all good things potentially to have available.
All right, well, it looks like we're still on, and there's still quite a few of you are joining us, so we'll try to keep going here and try to not end too late on time here, but just wanted to talk about just during the interview and how to project success. And I will tell you, it's hard, frankly, to get your foot in the door, but once you do, it is the interview that's going to sell you. And so it's really important that you convey confidence. So one of the weakest things that can happen, and from speaking again from experience, is if the very first impression I had when someone comes up, I finally meet them for the first time, maybe we've been emailing and or, you know, didn't see it mid-year, or maybe you did, but I don't really remember, is if you don't come up with a really good assured handshake, or your body language suggests that you are not prepared for the day, or you're super stressed out, you're running in late, you're sweating because you were late, those are the types of things that are going to be, again, those red flags. But I think ultimately is just some of the best interviews for me are the ones that are conversational. You can tell the candidate is, you know, of course there's nerves. We know that. Frankly, it's a nervous environment, but hopefully the team of people you're with is going to hopefully make you feel comfortable. But just make sure you do display that confidence. You don't slouch in your chair. You are actively listening and engaged when everyone's talking. I think those are going to be some of the most critical aspects. Obviously, have an appropriate and polished appearance. Make sure you're clean and fresh, and maybe And make sure you don't have any, for those women out there, don't have any low-cut blouses that show the girls. I mean, I'm going to tell you this from experience again. That's something that just is not appropriate. Um, but, just looking clean and polished, I think, is appropriate. Anticipate and plan for commonly encountered interview questions. And I mean, we'll have some on our slides here, but I think you can reach out to and look at various sources of example questions you may be asked. It is going to be very important not to read from a script or regurgitate a canned answer. And what we mean by that is, again, that conversational nature. So though you may have prepped for that question that came your way, don't do it in a way that's so canned and almost what I call Stepford wife, where it's just so regurgitated, it just almost sounds not genuine, I think is probably the biggest thing there. One of my biggest pet peeves is if I ask, do you have any questions for me? And you say, oh, no, I'm good. That is probably a tell. So either it shows that you're not interested at all, or you really just don't have anything to ask at all, because maybe you don't care or you don't like the program. But you always can have a question to ask, and don't hesitate to ask the same question of everybody. So like Adam said in the showcase, ask them, how did you get to where you are today? What is your favorite thing about this program? What do you think the program needs to work on? What is your favorite aspect of your current position? I mean, those are 4 or 5 questions I just threw out there that you can ask every single person and you're going to get a different answer. And those are time fillers. So if you truly do think you've got all your questions answered, but they're still asking you, what questions do you have? Those would be questions you could throw out. What not to do? Gosh, we could go on a whole nother hour probably. I think that, yeah.
And I'll just reiterate, I mean, again, in terms of conservative appearance, when I was in pharmacy school, we had an instructor that told us point blank that you have to wear a navy suit and that anything other than that was too flashy. And I don't know that that's true, but at the same time, you do need to be cognizant. While, we certainly recognize that everyone is an individual, you also don't want to be defined by your dress or by a piercing or by a tattoo. And again, whether this is, I'm not justifying this as correct, but people will make judgments based on appearance. Deanna talked about low-cut blouses. I will tell you, several years ago, we had an applicant who wore a very short skirt and high, very long leather boots. She was, probably, and I have to confess, I don't even recall, she may have been the most well-qualified applicant out of everyone we met. But there was a large cohort of the individuals that interviewed her that couldn't get past that image. And it's not just for women. We had a gentleman interview several years ago who wore a suede blazer. And there were several individuals that were hung up on that suede blazer. And again, he may have been saying the most wonderful and intelligent things, but people were making judgments just on something simple. So, again, you all have to define for yourselves what that means. But again, I guess I would say, take a long, hard look, and maybe here's an opportunity where you ask someone else as well. What do you think?
Yep. And then there was a question about taking notes during the interview. I would say absolutely that's not discouraged. In fact, I think the candidates that come to an interview with a list of questions written out that they know they want to ask, and maybe it's because you've prepped ahead of time, as Adam mentioned. You've looked at the itinerary. You know who you're going to interview with, and so you look them up. Okay, I'm going to meet with XYZ, who's the manager of ambulatory care. And so these are the questions I should ask this person. And having that in front of you and then scribbling a few things as they're talking, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it probably wouldn't be good to constantly have your head down in your notebook that you're writing on everything they're saying. So just, again, be mindful of that. But no, absolutely appropriate.
And I would amend that slightly to say, I would be cautious if you're taking notes on a device, like a laptop or a tablet or phone or something like that. because, when you're writing something down on a piece of paper, I think it's pretty obvious to the other people in the room that that's what you're doing. With other things, I think it becomes a fine line between, well, are they really paying attention to me, or are they looking at their email or messaging someone or doing something else like that?
Yep.
So I'm pretty old school, so I would say if it's paper, that's my preferred way. All right, so again, we've alluded to interview questions, and obviously you know that that's a major component of the day, because again, this is their opportunity to get to know about you at a greater depth than what you've already provided. So anticipating and preparing for, you're certainly not going to be able to absolutely know 100% every question that you're asked, but there's commonalities that you will see with every program, with every position, and starting to kind of plan out generally what you might talk about for some of these domains, I think, is part of that homework that really will help prepare and make for a more polished and substantive interview experience. So generally, there's always going to be a component of self-assessment, because indeed, that's a big part of residency, is learning how to effectively know who you are and where you've shown growth. So be able to talk about, what are your strengths? What are the positive attributes that you bring to this program day one? And conversely, what do you see as your areas for improvement? Because again, we all have them. You're going into residency training because you want to work on them. So we expect you to be able to identify and articulate them. And again, this is maybe semantics. I haven't used the word weaknesses because they are weaknesses. But I think it's important also to be able to talk to them in such a way that it's not negative, but accentuates and frames them positively. And maybe saying, I recognize throughout my fourth year, this is something that I've continually had to work on. I see that I've already shown growth from, May to December, but I know that this is something I will need to continue to refine and polish throughout my residency. Really being able to speak to that. Again, what are your goals? What is your professional and personal direction? Certainly, at least, is why are you seeking this position? What individual specific objectives do you have for taking this step? I'm not a big fan of the, what is your 5-year, what is your 10-year plan? But in general, recognizing there are a lot of people out there that ask that, or maybe even more broadly, if this is residency, where do you see yourself going after residency? How do you see yourself using this training? In general, what path do you want to cast yourself in? And again, nobody's committing you to that, but can you at least speak to the fact that you have, a vision beyond the next 6 months? What is your philosophy of practice? What does it mean for you to be a pharmacist? What does it mean for you to deliver patient-centered care? I think those are things that a lot of us haven't necessarily always thought about in a succinct and direct way. Could you describe it if you were asked? What's important to you? In turn, that helps illustrate to that potential employer, does this match with the position that I have and the skills and the characteristics that are going to be in that role? Again, as a pharmacist, getting some sense of your general professional knowledge. And I don't think, most residencies are necessarily going to hand you a 50-question pharmacotherapy quiz and say, hey, work through this. Now, certainly there's some that may have that couched in a case evaluation or some other format. But, even more broadly, look at what's on your CV. If you have listed that you gave an educational presentation about pancreatitis, don't be surprised if you get a question about pancreatitis. You need to know what's on that CV and be able to speak to it in an intelligent way. Another thing that I think is very relevant is knowing what are some of the current issues and hot topics within the profession of pharmacy. Being able to answer some of those speaks to your engagement in the profession as a whole, and that's going to be something that's very important to a lot of potential employers and programs.
Adam, there was a question there, and I don't know if you want to field or not. You see it there about an interview.
Sure. What is the best way to say, I don't know, or can I walk you through my thought process, but I'm obviously guessing? Are there more common types of clinical questions that come up? Well, I guess my answer to that is, in terms of some applied clinical knowledge, again, I don't think most interviews are necessarily going to view this opportunity as the interview as an opportunity to grill you. I guess I would encourage the same thing I would to the students or residents that I work with, because, there are questions that come up clinically that we don't know all the time. So being able to talk through your thought process, and maybe you don't know, the quote-unquote answer, but maybe you can get 80% of the way there. And if nothing else, that helps us see what your thought process is. Is it logical? Is it substantiated? As opposed to just sort of saying, I don't know. I guess kind of taking that a step back, if there's questions that are asked of you that you don't necessarily have an idea right offhand, it's okay to take a moment. I would rather have somebody pause, and even though that 10, 15 seconds may seem like an eternity to you sitting there in the chair, it's not. And using that time to think through and maybe craft something that's a little more logical and thought out, as opposed to just kind of stumbling and rambling and trying to land on something. Hopefully the more I talk, maybe something will stick. So those are both things to think about if you are caught sort of out of left field with some questions.
All right, and so Adam already moved on to the next slide, which is just talking about behavioral interviewing. And I think this is kind of the way that residencies and probably, frankly, employers, for those of you that aren't even looking at residencies, but are going. And that's just, and if you've never heard of it, it's just interviewing that's trying to get at some of the root of some behaviors, or I guess how you would answer a scenario question, for example. So it might not be a specific, they might still kind of intermix it with some specific questions about who you are and what you want to do and those types of things. But they're going to give you maybe scenarios. So tell me a time that you were met with a patient on XYZ rotation that there was a conflict that arose, or that you had, that the physician didn't accept your recommendation, and how did you handle that? So it might be very specific. It might be very open. So, tell me about a time that you worked with a team and there was maybe not cooperation amongst the team, or there was one person that did more than the other, and how you handled that. And what we're, ultimately interviewers are trying to get at is, again, your internal behaviors and how you handle those situations. There's not necessarily a wrong or right answer. There can be some that are maybe more preferable than others. For example, I'll admit there was a candidate last year I was interviewing for the acute care program, because I interviewed for that program as well, and it's strong interest in pediatrics. And when I asked about their pediatric rotation, and one of their favorite things that they had, it was not about the patients, it was about basically getting an answer right in front of the physician who didn't think that this candidate knew the answer. And I don't know, but the way it came across just seemed very, I don't know how to describe it, but it didn't seem like they really understood or cared about the patient. And truly, maybe they did, but for some reason, if that was their biggest highlight, I was not patient care, but it was more trying to show someone up or whatever, I thought just didn't come across right. So I think just, again, how you interview and answer these questions is just, again, be genuine, be thoughtful, prep in advance for some of these questions you may be asked. You can look up behavioral interviewing. Here's some examples of questions right here on the slide. And these are all fair game and likely something you will be asked. And then I think, Adam, there was one more slide here. Just easy ways to impress people would be to ask questions. I already said this enough, but, always have questions to ask. There's some examples here. I think, one of I'm not sure we quite got at the root of it, but, asking, what do we ask the residents? Well, ultimately, what is the day in the life of you as a resident? What are some of the things you struggle with? What are some of the things you really enjoy about your program? Would you do this program again? I mean, those are all fair questions. I think another one is asking a program what do their graduates go off to do, and ultimately that shows you maybe the caliber of resident that they graduate. If they're able to go into a field that you want to see yourself in the future, then obviously that's great. If all of the residents end up just going and working at and I hate to say this, but a chain pharmacy and just do dispensing and not clinical, then was that what happened there? And so I think those are some definitely opened up questions. Adam, do you have anything to add there?
No, and I guess one question going back to before we talked about questions that I dread as program director, I'll tell you one that I really enjoy answering and I think is very thoughtful is, what characteristics do you as program director feel predict success in this position, or do you value the most? And again, to me, the types of questions where they're really getting at, wanting to know what I find important, but also trying to connect it back to them. And I think that's always a very thoughtful and meaningful question to have. And again, I mean, as Deanna said, I think that's also arguably a question you could ask of multiple individuals throughout the day.
Absolutely.
So, all right. A reiteration to everyone, I mean, your interview day is going to have multiple structured components, but there's always going to be transitions and downtime, whether that's when you're moving from point A to point B, or maybe a break, kind of a 15 minutes quiet time as you're shifting gears. But remember, even during all of those quiet times, you are still on stage and being interviewed. So be cognizant. Again, I would hope that this is something that would go without saying, but recognizing that even though they are not formally asking you questions, any individual, whether that's support staff or other personnel from that system or company or site, treat them with courtesy, be friendly. You want to make a good impression on them because they will have input on this process as well. Similarly, if you are interviewing at the same time as other applicants, be cognizant of your interactions with them. Again, I can think of situations in the past where we've had applicants, very much project one thing kind of when they knew that they were formally being interviewed, and then have some different and somewhat opposing characteristics in other types of interactions when they didn't think that they were being quote-unquote interviewed. And that's a big red flag. So, be cognizant of that. If your interview includes a meal, dining out, off-site, so not at the facility where the program is, I mean, again, that's designed to be a bit more casual usually. I mean, they want to, number one, enjoy the meal, enjoy their time with you, and generally that's a time for them to get to know you a bit better as a person. But again, don't forget, you are still being interviewed. So, I think it's very much a great opportunity. I mean, like I said, it's designed to get to know you beyond just that role of a pharmacist. Talk about some of your other interests, what makes you a well-rounded person, being able to speak to that. You want to be engaged in the conversation with those that you're out to dinner with. You also want to not monopolize it, though. Finding the balance. Nothing is more painful than taking someone out to dinner that it's like pulling teeth to get them to talk. But at the same time, if you're overbearing and dominating conversation and not letting anyone else have a word in edgewise, those are both likely going to be viewed very negatively and have some impact on your evaluation. Obviously, being cognizant of what you're talking about. If you think it is at all controversial, that is probably not the time to think about or talk about it. Another question that comes up a lot is, what do I do with food? And oftentimes, maybe they give you a limited menu of choices, but I think a good rule of thumb is follow the lead of who's taking you out to dinner. Let them order first. And based on what they order, kind of let that be your guide. You don't want to be the first one to order and say, well, I'm going to have the $70 surf and turf, and then they come at it and say, well, I'll just take the $6 salad. And maybe that was totally unintentional, but again, potentially that puts you in a bad light. So kind of follow the lead. I would say the same thing about alcohol. Different companies or programs are going to have different policies, and maybe that's not even an issue. But, I would say if the individuals that you're with order a glass of wine or have a beer, and that's something you would like to do, I think that that's probably reasonable. But if in any doubt, don't do it. Because, again, you don't want to be the person that orders the beer and then scandalizes everyone at the table because, we weren't supposed to or what have you. So, again, follow the lead and generally let that be your guide.
I just had a couple more things to add on that, Adam. If you have a dietary restriction too, because during the day they'll often have a lunch or potentially lunch or maybe even a breakfast, don't hesitate to let them know that. We definitely are not trying to make you eat something that you can't eat or whatnot. So please let that know. And like he mentioned too, all the small times count. If you have opportunities where you are in a group setting, which will happen often, a lot of interviews nowadays do interview, say, 3, 4 candidates at the same time. Obviously, most, if not all, hopefully, of your interviews will be by yourself. But there'll be times where there'll be group settings where, for example, the residency director is telling about the program in a group, or there's a tour of the institution. Those group dynamics are extremely beneficial, and something that do come up in discussion when we're ranking candidates is how did the candidate interact in that group? Were they the ones maximizing the entire conversation and not allowing the other candidates to get a word in edgewise? Or were they a fly on the wall and weren't saying a darn word? And those are probably the ones that probably, will maybe be a red flag, if anything. But that group dynamic is something that we tease out as well. And we definitely utilize the residents for feedback on candidates and the time spent with them. So be mindful of the time with the residents as well.
Agreed. So last slide, and that's really after the interview is complete, circling back and following up. And I think everyone would agree that having some type of personalized thank you is very, certainly puts you in a good light. And that's helpful in a couple different ways. I mean, number one, quite frankly, it's another opportunity for you to affirm your interest in that position. And, to a very limited degree, show them a little bit about you. Now, generally what most people are not going to want to see in a thank you, again, is a 2-page, rehash of your letter of intent, reiterating every single characteristic about you and tying that back to the program. But in a very succinct, brief way, if you can tie something back to the day, I think oftentimes it's very meaningful. just saying I very much enjoyed my time spent at your site. After discussing everything, I really find the direction that you're taking towards during, establishing this service, something that really aligns with my professional goals. I mean, rather than being totally generic, if you can find one or two things that came out of that day, I think that that's a very easy way of personalizing it and really kind of emphasizing that you were engaged and paying attention. What I would not encourage is what I would call the bulk mail approach, where you come up with one general form and then just drop in names. Because, again, most program directors and faculty have seen many of these, and we're generally pretty skilled at picking sort of those generic communications out. At worst, and especially if you do it via email, it's very easy for you to put the wrong name in and then accidentally send. And that as somebody who's received that before, where I've gotten a dear Dr. so-and-so at a totally different program, it's painfully obvious to me that that's what happened. So, to kind of take that a step back, does the thank you need to be handwritten? Not necessarily. I think it's still, you can craft a very personalized and individualized email. But having said that, I mean, generally handwritten, we know you, if nothing else, at least took the time to, write it out to whoever that individual is. So I think that's up to you to determine how you want to do that. I guess the last thing that I would say about that is, if you have certain constraints or are strongly impassioned, I mean, certainly there's a time to be honest, but you also don't want to come off as being desperate. And I guess a good example of that is, let's say that that you're constrained geographically, and you really want to make a good impression on a program that's in a certain geographic area. Maybe it's reasonable to say, because of my need to be in city X next year, I very much would like to see myself as a resident in your program or something like that. Maybe that's okay, and I think that that's reasonable. What I would not suggest doing is saying, oh my gosh, I'm totally going to rank you number one. You're the only place I'm going to put down. You better rank me or else I'm going to throw myself off a bridge or something like that. And obviously that's pretty extreme. But, again, and we're laughing a little bit, but I've seen communications that intimate that highly. So, you want to make yourself desirable. You want to find that connection. But just like being a date, you don't want to kind of throw yourself out there as being too much wanting this. I guess if finding the balance there is what I would urge.
Yeah, and I think the only thing to add to that briefly, Adam, is there was a question about, kind of back to the clinical questions, and if you were asked, I think this would be a post-interview follow-up. If there was something that you were asked or maybe you didn't know in the interview, I don't think it is a bad thing to follow up with that. In fact, that has happened to my candidates. I have them present on a topic or a presentation, and sometimes a question will be asked at the end that maybe they are like, oh, I'd love to get back to you at that and whatnot. And I would have, there's actually, it shows that you do have the follow through if you are willing to kind of email that back. So I don't think that's a bad thing about that. And the other thing is, I don't know about your, Adam, I mentioned the bulk mail approach, but I also don't think you need to send a letter or an thank you note to every single person you meet.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things. Sometimes it's hard, but I personally don't believe, if you even sent it to the director and you said, and the residents, each resident, and maybe then the director, and said, tell your team how wonderful I thought the day was or whatever, that's okay. But I think it's just be mindful of that. You might even ask that. I don't know if that's, I guess I've never been asked that question. Is it okay if I don't send a letter to everybody? But I just think I only met with them for a few minutes, or they were on a
Yeah.
or something, I don't think you need to send them a
And,
letter.
and I would agree, and I don't know that there's sort of a magic answer that you can apply to every interview setting. I guess I would say that the more substantive and the longer the interaction that you have with an individual, kind of the more likely I would suggest maybe that would be someone to send a personalized, expression of gratitude towards.
Yeah.
So again, if it's just, a few minutes in sort of a bulk forum, probably not. If you interviewed one-on-one with them for an hour, yes, I think that would be very reasonable.
I agree.
One question that was thrown out before the webinar even began that we haven't specifically addressed on a slide relates to looking at programs for those individuals that know that they likely would see themselves doing a PGY2 residency. And I believe the question was phrased such that would it be more advantageous to look for a program at a site that has both a PGY1 and PGY2 with the thought that it's better to do the early commit and direct admit, even if that PGY1 program in that individual's eyes isn't very strong, versus going to a PGY1 program that doesn't have a PGY2 that then would require that applicant to go through the matching and interview process. So I may turf that to Deanna because I think we can probably answer this from two sides of the coin. So I'll actually answer that first as a PGY1 director and as a site that does not have a PGY2. I guess I would have to say I think that you need to evaluate each program on its own merits and make the decision that you think is right based on that PGY1 program. And I say that in part because I think there are a lot of individuals in their last year of pharmacy school that say, yes, I'm going to do a PGY2, yes, I'm going to do a PGY2, and then once they actually get into that first year, their mind changes. Whether that's because of their practice interests evolve, or sometimes life happens. Now maybe they are in a different place, and another year of training isn't right for them. And I guess knowing that, I think it just makes sense to have make the decision one step at a time and do that based on what that person sees as the merits of that PGY1 program. And certainly, I think knowing that there's the possibility to do an early commit is a factor that goes into that, but I don't think that should be the only factor in that decision.
Yeah, and honestly, just to feel that with so our program, my specific program is very unique, but our university has, oh gosh, I think we have 5 now PGY2s. And so I would just say the applicant pool we typically get are those that are looking at a PGY2 program in one of the areas that we had. Because frankly, the PGY2 programs out there are, a lot of them do early commit. And I think you just have to be aware of that. So if you are going to a PGY1 program and you know for a certain fact that you want to do a PGY2 in that area, obviously the best answer would be try to find that program that has the best of both, has an awesome PGY1 and has those PGY2s available to you. But I agree with Adam. I mean, going to a separate institution for a PGY1 and a PGY2 is also really good because you get to learn different aspects of different health systems. So I don't know the correct answer, and I think it truly just depends on what your general interests are, and if those programs that you know are PGY2s that you really know you want.
And realistically, to some degree, it probably depends also on what focus for the PGY2 as well.
Yes, yeah.
Because there are some specialties that are very popular or hot commodities and inherently probably more competitive than others. So that may be a factor as well. You know, if it's a PGY2 where there's only 6 programs nationwide, you know, right off the bat, that limits some of the flexibility and likelihood that you would have off the go.
And then there was one other question that was pre our webinar too that I probably skipped over just because of time, and now frankly we're 45 minutes over time.
I know.
So
Thank you everyone for sticking with us. So we warned Karen that we both are pretty long-winded. So.
But the question was, how do I frankly pick? How do I pick what programs to apply to? And I honestly, that's a hard choice. And I think for you as candidates, it depends on location, probably size of institution you want to go to. Is there a specific population of patients you want to see, for example, veterans or more rural health or community or ambulatory care or whatnot? So that might kind of start to limit your factors. But then as you just kind of, again, go to your pros and cons assessment, as we talked about, you might really be able to kind of tease off those things through looking at the things on their websites, reaching out to the programs, and of course, if you go to mid-year, then doing the showcase in a mindful way, and like Adam said, mapping it out. If you're able to hit some spots, inevitably you will find those programs that you do not want to interview at, because you'll just find that, you know, no one looks happy there. They just don't seem like they're interested. Or you'll find those programs that you're like, oh my gosh, I have to be there. I want to be there. So I think that'll help. But frankly, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes right now. Gosh, when Adam and I were looking at residencies, it wasn't nearly as competitive. And but just remember that most candidates do get their first or second picks. There are candidates, obviously, that go unranked, and that there's been success in the second phase match. And I guess one last thing I'd say is, if you don't get your dream residency, it's not the end of the world. There is a lot of people that if they don't get what they want, they ended up still getting a great job, or, you know, have another year of good experience under your belt, and then you try at it again next year. So, you know, you've been in pharmacy school this long, and one more year, if you don't end up getting that program of your dreams, is not a big deal.
And, you know, an extra year of experience is something that you can really leverage to your advantage, because immediately that's something potentially that differentiates you from a lot of the applicants. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Not necessarily that that's something we would advocate for, but if you find yourself in your position, I think you can actually turn it into a very positive thing as well.
Absolutely.
And I would just go back to say, I mean, just like knowing yourself and knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are, I mean, really when it comes to finding programs, you have to determine for yourself what are the most important characteristics that I'm looking for. And again, that is going to be something that's very individual from person to person to person. But use that as your compass. You know, the best program for one person may not be for another. You know, and that goes back to the fact that every program has its high points and strengths and things that it's really good at, and things that it doesn't focus on as much, or it isn't as good at, or doesn't deliver on. You know, and you just have to align those two things together and use this process to help you define that to the best of your ability. So much like Deanna, I'm probably a little Pollyanna, and I know it's easy for me to say on this end of things, but I do believe that there's a right program out there for just about everybody.
I agree.
So with that, again, Deanna and I want to thank all of you for sticking with us and listening. Certainly, if you have any other questions regarding any of the information that we presented or discussed this evening, please don't be afraid to contact Deanna or myself. Again, I hope that we've provided some very valuable and things for you to think about as you go through this process. We wish you all the best of luck as you proceed through your adventure, finding the right next step. And with that, we are very proud to be your brother, and we wish you a good night.
Yeah. Thank you guys.